The video notification popped up on my phone screen at exactly 11:47 p.m., and within 30 seconds of watching it, my entire world crumbled. There was my mother, Patricia Holloway, standing at the Riverside Community Center's annual charity auction in downtown Millbrook, wine glass raised high, completely unaware that someone was filming her as she loudly declared to a crowd of our neighbors and family friends, "My daughter Valentina? She's been such a disappointment. 29 years old and still can't figure out what she wants to do with her life." My hands trembled as I sat in my penthouse suite at the Four Seasons in Manhattan, having just returned from closing a multi-million-dollar acquisition deal that would soon shock everyone who thought they knew me. In less than 12 hours, my custom Gulfstream G650 would touch down on the very lawn where my mother was currently humiliating me, carrying documents that would reveal the truth about who I really was and what I'd been quietly building while everyone assumed I was just another failed millennial living in my childhood bedroom. But let me back up, because the story of how a small-town girl from Millbrook, Connecticut became the secret owner of a tech empire worth over $50 million, while her own family believed she was unemployed, is more twisted than any fiction you could imagine. My name is Valentina Reeves, though most people in my hometown still call me Tina, that awkward girl who supposedly dropped out of college, moved back home, and never quite figured herself out. For the past 3 years, I've been living what felt like a double life, so complex that sometimes I forgot which version of myself I was supposed to be on any given day. To my family and the tight-knit community of Millbrook, I was the cautionary tale, the girl who had so much potential, but somehow squandered it all. The daughter who broke her parents' hearts by abandoning her pre-med studies at Yale after just 2 years, only to return home with vague explanations about needing time to think and exploring different paths. My mother, Patricia, a respected high school principal who had spent decades molding young minds and building her reputation as someone who never gave up on anyone, seemed to view my perceived failure as her greatest professional and personal defeat. My father, William Reeves, the town's beloved family doctor who had delivered half the babies in Millbrook over the past 30 years, would introduce me to his colleagues with an apologetic smile and a quick subject change. "This is our daughter Valentina. She's finding herself right now." The phrase had become so automatic that I wondered if he'd forgotten there might be more to say about me. My younger sister Caroline, now a successful pediatric resident at Boston Children's Hospital, had become the golden child by default. Every family gathering featured extended discussions about Caroline's achievements, her awards, her research, her bright future. And then there was me, sitting quietly in the corner, nodding along and asking supportive questions about her work, while internally managing a business empire that spanned 3 countries and employed over 200 people. The irony was suffocating. What my family didn't know, what nobody in Millbrook knew, was that my dropping out of Yale hadn't been a failure at all. It had been a calculated risk that had paid off beyond my wildest dreams. While my classmates were cramming for organic chemistry exams, I had been developing a revolutionary software platform that would eventually be licensed by Fortune 500 companies worldwide. While they were competing for summer internships, I was already generating 6-figure revenues from my dorm room. The decision to leave Yale hadn't been about giving up on my dreams. It had been about betting everything on a vision that was too big for lecture halls and textbooks. But try explaining that to a family who measured success exclusively in degrees, titles, and traditional career paths. For 3 years, I'd maintain the charade. I'd wake up in my childhood bedroom, the same room where I'd once dreamed of becoming a doctor like my father, and spend my days managing international conference calls from the local library, negotiating million-dollar contracts from coffee shops, and building strategic partnerships while sitting in my beat-up Honda Civic in parking lots around town. I'd told my family I was freelancing and doing some consulting work, which technically wasn't a lie. They assumed this meant I was barely scraping by, probably doing random gig work to avoid having to get a real job. They had no idea that my freelancing involved advising tech startups on scaling strategies, or that my consulting work included serving as an anonymous board member for 3 different companies. The elaborate deception had started as a way to avoid awkward questions and expectations while I focused on building something extraordinary. I'd planned to reveal everything once I reached certain milestones. First $1 million in revenue, then $5 million, then $10 million. But somehow each milestone came and went without the right moment presenting itself. How do you casually mention to your family that you've been lying about your entire life for years? And now, watching my mother's public humiliation of me being broadcast to social media by someone at the charity auction, I realized that the time for casual revelations had passed. Tomorrow morning, the truth would arrive in the most dramatic way possible, not through a heart-to-heart conversation or family meeting, but through the unmistakable roar of jet engines and the landing of a private aircraft on the front lawn of 47 Maple Street, the modest colonial house where the disappointment had been quietly planning her vindication for 3 long years. As I sat there in my Manhattan penthouse, surrounded by the trappings of a success that nobody in my hometown could imagine, I made a decision that would change everything. It was time for Valentina Reeves, the perceived failure, to meet Valentina Reeves, the tech mogul. And I had a feeling that tomorrow would be a day that Millbrook, Connecticut would never forget. I forced myself to keep watching the video, even though every word felt like a knife twisting deeper into my chest. The person filming, I could see from the angle it was probably Mrs. Henderson from down the street, had caught the entire brutal moment in devastating detail. Honestly, I don't know where we went wrong with Valentina, my mother continued, her voice carrying that particular tone of disappointment mixed with resignation that I'd grown to recognize over the past 3 years. She was standing near the auction's silent bid tables, surrounded by at least 15 people I'd known since childhood. Mrs. Patterson, who used to give me piano lessons, Mr. Rodriguez, who owned the hardware store where I had bought supplies for high school science projects, the Yamamoto family, whose daughter had been my study partner all through elementary school. They were all nodding sympathetically as my mother painted me as the family's greatest failure. She had everything going for her, Mom went on, taking another sip of wine. Full scholarship to Yale, pre-med track, stellar grades in high school. Her father and I thought we'd done everything right, but sometimes you just can't predict when a child is going to throw their life away. The crowd murmured in understanding, and I watched Mrs. Patterson reach out to pat my mother's arm consolingly. These things happen, Patricia. You can't blame yourself. Oh, but I do, my mother replied, and for a moment I saw genuine pain flash across her face. I keep wondering if we were too supportive, too encouraging. Maybe if we'd been stricter, pushed harder, she wouldn't have just given up on everything. The word everything hit me like a physical blow. If only she knew that while she was standing there mourning my supposed surrender, I had 3 different acquisition offers sitting in my email inbox, each one worth more than my father would earn in his entire medical career. What's she doing now? Asked Dr. Morrison, our family dentist, his voice gentle but curious in that way that meant the whole town had been speculating about the Reeves family's troubled daughter. My mother's laugh was bitter, and I had to grip my phone tighter to keep from dropping it. Living in her childhood bedroom, claims she's doing some kind of freelance work on her computer. But honestly, David, I think she just spends most of her time playing video games and watching Netflix. At 29, can you imagine? The crowd exchanged those knowing looks that adults share when discussing a young person who hasn't met their expectations. I'd seen those same expressions countless times over the past 3 years. At the grocery store, at church, at the bank. The look that said, "What a waste," and "Thank goodness my kids didn't turn out like that." Has she considered going back to school? Mrs. Yamamoto asked helpfully. It's never too late to change direction. We've suggested it 100 times, my mother sighed dramatically. Community college, trade school, even just getting a part-time job at a local business to build some work experience. But she insists she's working on something big with this computer stuff. It's been 3 years of working on something big, and we've seen absolutely nothing to show for it. The crowd was eating this up. I could see it in their faces. The mixture of pity for my parents and barely concealed satisfaction that their own children had turned out better.
In a small town like Millbrook, everyone knew everyone else's business, and the story of Patricia and William Reeves's disappointing daughter had clearly become a favorite topic of conversation. The worst part, my mother continued, and I could hear her voice getting louder as the wine and the sympathetic audience emboldened her, is that she acts like she's doing something important. She takes these mysterious phone calls, disappears for hours claiming she has meetings, though God knows where or with whom, and acts all secretive about this so-called work of hers. Mr. Rodriguez shook his head sadly. It's probably one of those pyramid schemes things, Patricia. My nephew got caught up in something similar. They make the kids think they're running their own businesses, but it's all smoke and mirrors. That's exactly what William thinks, my mother exclaimed, as if she'd found a kindred spirit. He's convinced she's fallen for some kind of online scam and is too embarrassed to admit it. Either that, or she's just making the whole thing up to avoid having to get a real job. The casual cruelty of it took my breath away. Here was my mother, the woman who had taught me to believe in myself, who had cheered from the sidelines at every school play and science fair, who had once told me I could accomplish anything I set my mind to, and she was publicly theorizing that I was either a scam victim or a pathological liar. "Have you thought about giving her an ultimatum?" suggested Mrs. Patterson. "Sometimes tough love is the only thing that works with kids who don't grow up."
My mother nodded thoughtfully. "William and I have discussed it. We're thinking of telling her she has 6 months to either go back to school, get a real job, or find somewhere else to live. We can't enable this behavior forever." 6 months. They were planning to kick me out of the house where I'd been quietly building an empire that would soon employ more people than worked in all of downtown Millbrook combined. The irony was so absurd it was almost funny. Except nothing about this felt funny at all. The video continued for another excruciating 2 minutes, with my mother fielding more questions and suggestions about how to handle their problem child. She shared details about my daily routine, completely wrong, my financial situation, catastrophically wrong, and my future prospects, so wrong it was almost laughable. By the time the video ended, I was shaking with a combination of rage, hurt, and something else I couldn't quite identify. It took me a moment to realize what that feeling was. Relief. For 3 years, I'd been protecting my family from the truth, convinced that the revelation would somehow be traumatic for them. I'd worried about how they'd react to learning that their failure daughter had been lying to them, how they'd handle the knowledge that I'd been successful beyond their wildest dreams, while letting them suffer the embarrassment of having a disappointing child. But watching my mother systematically destroy my reputation in front of half the town, I realized I'd been protecting the wrong person. I'd been so focused on sparing their feelings that I'd forgotten about protecting my own dignity. The time for gentle revelations and careful conversations had passed. Tomorrow morning, when my Gulfstream touched down on their front lawn, the truth would arrive whether they were ready for it or not. I set my phone down on the marble countertop of my Manhattan penthouse and walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Central Park. The city sparkled below me like a circuit board, each light representing dreams, ambitions, and the kind of success that most people could only imagine. At 29, I had achieved more than I'd ever dared to dream possible, yet the people who mattered most to me had no idea who I really was. My name is Valentina Catherine Reeves, and I am the founder and CEO of Nexus Technologies, a software development company that has quietly revolutionized how Fortune 500 companies manage their data infrastructure. Our proprietary algorithms are currently running on systems that process over 2 billion transactions daily across 3 continents. When people use their credit cards at major retailers, book flights through popular travel websites, or transfer money through their banking apps, there's a good chance they're interacting with code that I wrote in my childhood bedroom in Millbrook, Connecticut. But that's just the beginning of who I am. I'm also the silent partner in Quantum Dynamics, a cybersecurity firm that protects some of the world's largest financial institutions from digital threats.
Last year, we prevented over 15,000 attempted cyber attacks, saving our clients an estimated $400 million in potential losses. The Pentagon has my personal phone number, though they know me only as V. Reeves and have never seen my face during our video conferences. 3 months ago, I became the youngest person ever to be offered a seat on the board of directors at Meridian Global, a consulting firm that advises governments on technology policy. I turned them down because accepting would have meant revealing my identity, and I wasn't ready for that level of public exposure. Not yet. But perhaps most surprisingly, I'm the anonymous benefactor behind the Millbrook Community Technology Center, the brand new facility that opened last year, right in my hometown. My mother, in her role as high school principal, has praised the mysterious donor countless times in local newspaper interviews, never suspecting that the generous tech entrepreneur from New York who funded the entire project was her own supposedly unemployed daughter. The journey to this point began during my sophomore year at Yale, though the seeds were planted much earlier. As a child, I'd always been fascinated by computers, but in a town like Millbrook, that wasn't exactly encouraged for girls. My parents, both accomplished in traditional fields, assumed my interest in technology was just a phase I'd outgrow once I'd discovered more suitable career paths. They weren't cruel about it, quite the opposite. They were loving, supportive parents who wanted the best for me, but their definition of the best was limited to what they understood: medicine, law, teaching, maybe business if I was feeling adventurous. When I tried to explain my passion for coding and software development, they'd nod politely and then redirect the conversation toward my pre-med requirements. At Yale, I was officially a pre-med student with a computer science minor, but I spent far more time in the computer labs than I did in biology lectures. While my classmates were memorizing anatomical diagrams, I was teaching myself advanced programming languages and developing algorithms that could solve real-world problems.
I spent the next 6 months developing a prototype for a more efficient, user-friendly database management system. What started as a solution for Yale's administrative problems evolved into something much larger, a comprehensive platform that could be adapted for any organization dealing with large-scale data management challenges. By the end of my sophomore year, I had a working product and my first client, a mid-sized insurance company in Hartford that had heard about my work through a Yale alumni connection. They paid me $50,000 for a customized version of my software, and suddenly I faced a choice that would define the rest of my life. I could continue on the safe path my parents had mapped out for me, finish my pre-med degree, take the MCAT, apply to medical schools, and become the doctor they'd always envisioned. Or I could take an enormous risk and bet everything on a business idea that might fail spectacularly. The decision wasn't easy. I loved my parents and desperately wanted their approval. I knew that leaving Yale would devastate them, that they'd see it as throwing away opportunities they'd worked their entire lives to provide for me. But I also knew that if I didn't pursue this path, I'd spend the rest of my life wondering, what if? So I made a choice that seemed insane to everyone around me. I took a leave of absence from Yale, moved back home to Millbrook, and turned my childhood bedroom into the headquarters of what would become a multi-million-dollar technology empire. The first year was grueling. I worked 18-hour days, survived on energy drinks and determination, and watched my savings account dwindle while I invested every penny back into the business. My parents were supportive, but clearly worried, constantly asking when I planned to return to school and whether I was sure I was making the right decision. I told them I needed just 1 year to see if the business could work. That was 3 years ago. During those 3 years, Nexus Technologies grew from a one-person operation to a company with offices in New York, Los Angeles, and London. We secured contracts with major corporations, hired brilliant developers and engineers, and became profitable beyond my wildest projections. I went from having a few $1,000s in my bank account to managing a business worth over $50 million. But here's the part that nobody in Millbrook understands. I didn't stay in my childhood bedroom because I was a failure. I stayed because it was perfect for what I needed to accomplish. My parents' house provided a stable, quiet environment where I could focus entirely on building something extraordinary without the distractions and expenses of city living. Every dollar I saved on rent and lifestyle costs went directly back into growing the business. I also stayed because I genuinely loved being close to my family, even if they didn't understand what I was doing. I treasured our Sunday dinners, even when they were filled with concerned questions about my future. I enjoyed helping my father with his garden and listening to my mother's stories about her students. In a world where success often requires sacrificing personal relationships, I'd found a way to have both, or so I thought. What I hadn't anticipated was how my family's perception of me would shift over time. As months turned into years without traditional markers of success, no degree completion, no conventional job, no public recognition of my achievements, their support gradually transformed into worry, then disappointment, and finally, as tonight's video had brutally demonstrated, public embarrassment. The woman in that video, the one my mother described as a directionless failure living in her childhood bedroom, was a complete fiction. But it was a fiction that my own choices had helped create, and now I had to decide whether to continue living in the shadows or step into the light, regardless of the consequences. Standing in my penthouse that night, watching the city lights blur through tears I refused to let fall, I realized there was so much more to the story that my family would never suspect. The painful irony wasn't just that they saw me as a failure while I was secretly successful. It was that every single thing they criticized me for was actually evidence of how much I'd been quietly sacrificing for them. Those mysterious phone calls my mother had mocked in front of the entire charity auction, half of them were with the board of directors at Millbrook General Hospital, where I'd been anonymously funding a new pediatric wing for the past 18 months. The project was set to break ground next spring, and my father, who had spent countless nights lamenting the hospital's outdated children's facilities, would finally see his dream of a state-of-the-art pediatric unit become reality. He just didn't know his disappointing daughter was the one making it happen. The other half of those calls were even more personal. For the past 2 years, I'd been working with a private medical research foundation to fund experimental treatments for early onset Alzheimer's disease. My mother's father, my beloved grandfather Eugene, had died from Alzheimer's when I was 16. I'd watched it devastate our entire family, but it had hit my mother the hardest. She'd spent years afterwards talking about how helpless she'd felt, how she'd wished there had been better treatment options, how she hoped future families wouldn't have to watch their loved ones disappear the way we had.
So I'd quietly donated over $3 million to research specifically focused on the type of genetic markers that had contributed to Grandpa Eugene's condition. The foundation had made significant breakthroughs in early detection and treatment protocols, and their work was now being tested in clinical trials across the country. My mother's DNA profile suggested she might carry similar risk factors, and I was determined that if she ever faced the same battle, there would be options available that hadn't existed for her father. But the medical research was just the beginning of what I'd been hiding. Those hours I supposedly spent playing video games and watching Netflix in my childhood bedroom, I was actually managing a scholarship fund that I'd established at 4 different universities, specifically designed to help first-generation college students from small towns pursue degrees in STEM fields. Over the past 3 years, I'd funded the complete education of 37 students who otherwise wouldn't have been able to afford college. Many of them were girls from families just like mine, families who loved them but couldn't quite understand their passion for technology and science. The scholarship recipients didn't know my real name, but I'd been mentoring several of them remotely, helping them navigate the challenges of being outsiders in competitive academic environments. Just last week, I'd gotten an email from Sarah Chen, a girl from rural Montana whose parents owned a small farm. She had written to thank her anonymous benefactor for making it possible for her to complete her computer science degree, and she had attached a photo of herself at graduation, surrounded by family members who were finally beginning to understand that their daughter's weird obsession with computers had led to something extraordinary. The bitter irony was that I'd been providing for other families the kind of support and understanding that I desperately wanted from my own. Even more painful was the truth behind my supposed laziness and lack of direction. Every morning for the past 3 years, I'd woken up at 4:30 a.m. to handle international business calls before my parents got up for work. I'd learned to manage teams across multiple time zones, coordinate with clients in Europe and Asia, and run board meetings all before 7 a.m. when my family assumed I was just sleeping in because I had nowhere important to be. My aimless wandering around town in my beat-up Honda Civic? I was actually conducting site visits for the various community improvement projects I'd been secretly funding. The new playground equipment at Millbrook Elementary School, installed last summer after the old swings and slides were deemed unsafe, that was me. The upgraded computer lab at the public library, complete with high-speed internet and the latest software, also me. The small business grants that had helped 3 local shops avoid closing during the economic downturn, me again. I'd been systematically investing in every aspect of the community that had shaped me, trying to give back to the town that had given me such a strong foundation. But I'd done it all anonymously, partly because I wasn't ready to reveal my success, and partly because I wanted the focus to be on the community benefits rather than on me as an individual. The cruel joke was that my parents had become unwitting beneficiaries of my generosity multiple times without ever knowing it. When my father's medical practice had struggled with outdated equipment 2 years ago, I'd arranged for him to receive a healthcare innovation grant that covered the cost of new diagnostic machines. The application process had been suspiciously easy, and the funding had come through unusually quickly, but he had been so relieved and grateful that he hadn't questioned the good fortune. When my mother's school had faced budget cuts that would have eliminated the art and music programs she had worked so hard to build, a mysterious arts education foundation had stepped in with emergency funding to save every single program. She'd spent weeks trying to track down the donors to thank them properly, never suspecting that her own daughter had been monitoring the board meetings and had moved quickly to prevent the programs from being cut. Even my sister Caroline, the family's success story, had unknowingly benefited from my help. During her medical residency, when she had been struggling with student loan payments and the stress of trying to build her career while managing crushing debt, she had received a need-based fellowship that had covered her expenses for an entire year. The fellowship had been merit-based, they'd told her, awarded to the most promising young doctors in her program. What they hadn't mentioned was that the fellowship fund had been endowed by an anonymous donor who happened to have a sister in exactly Caroline's situation. I watched my family stress about money, worry about the community's future, and struggle with challenges that I could easily solve, all while maintaining the fiction that I was the family member who couldn't get her life together. It had been exhausting and heartbreaking, but I'd convinced myself that I was protecting them from the complicated truth about who I'd become and how I'd gotten there. But tonight, after watching my mother publicly eviscerate my character while standing in a community center that I'd helped fund, in front of neighbors whose children were attending colleges on scholarships I'd provided, next to a father whose medical practice I'd saved, and a sister whose career I'd supported, I realized that my protection had become a prison. I wasn't protecting my family from anything except the truth about how much they meant to me and how far I was willing to go to ensure their happiness and success. Instead of seeing me as someone who loved them enough to sacrifice recognition for their benefit, they saw me as someone who loved them so little that I was willing to disappoint them indefinitely.
The woman my mother had described in that video, the aimless failure who contributed nothing to her family or community, was the exact opposite of who I actually was. But I was the only one who knew that, and suddenly, that felt like the loneliest truth in the world. The path that led me to this moment of painful irony began on a rainy Tuesday afternoon in October, 3.5 years ago, when everything I thought I knew about my future changed in the span of a single phone call. I was sitting in Sterling Memorial Library at Yale, surrounded by organic chemistry textbooks and flashcards for my upcoming MCAT prep course, when my phone buzzed with a call from home. It was unusual for my parents to call during my study hours. They'd always been respectful of my academic schedule, so I stepped outside to answer, assuming it was something routine about holiday plans or family logistics. "Valentina, honey, I need you to sit down." My mother's voice was shaking in a way I'd never heard before, immediately sending ice through my veins. "It's about your father." The next 60 seconds shattered my world. Dad had collapsed during morning rounds at the hospital. Heart attack, emergency surgery, touch and go. The words blurred together as I sank onto a bench outside the library, watching my classmates walk by with their backpacks and coffee cups, completely unaware that my entire universe was imploding. "How bad is it?" I managed to ask. "We don't know yet," Mom whispered. "The surgery went well, but there was damage. Significant damage. The cardiologist is saying, he's saying Dad might not be able to continue practicing medicine, at least not in the same way." For my father, medicine wasn't just a career, it was his identity, his passion, his entire reason for getting up every morning. He'd been Millbrook's beloved family doctor for over 25 years, delivering babies who were now bringing their own children to see him. The idea of Dad not being able to practice was like imagining him not being able to breathe. I was on a bus back to Connecticut within 2 hours, my organic chemistry exam forgotten, my MCAT prep materials abandoned in my dorm room. Nothing mattered except getting home to my family. The next few weeks were a blur of hospital visits, insurance paperwork, and whispered conversations between my parents when they thought I wasn't listening. Dad's recovery was slower than anyone had hoped. The heart attack had been massive, and the damage was extensive enough that his cardiologist was recommending early retirement. At 54, my father was facing the end of the career that had defined his entire adult life. But the medical crisis was only the beginning of our problems. During one of my late-night vigils at Dad's bedside, while he slept fitfully under a tangle of monitoring wires, Mom finally broke down and told me the truth about our family's financial situation. Dad's medical practice, while successful in terms of patient care, had never been particularly profitable. He'd always prioritized helping people over maximizing income, frequently treating patients who couldn't afford to pay and accepting insurance reimbursements that barely covered his costs. "We don't have the savings we should," Mom confessed, tears streaming down her face as we sat in the hospital cafeteria at 2 a.m., surviving on vending machine coffee and exhaustion. "If he can't work," the implications hung in the air between us. No income, mounting medical bills, a mortgage on the house I'd grown up in. Carolyn was already in medical school, her education funded by loans that would take decades to repay. They'd been counting on Dad working at least 65 to build any kind of retirement security. "What about disability insurance?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. Mom's bitter laugh told me everything. "Not enough. Nowhere near enough to maintain our current lifestyle, and definitely not enough to cover his medical expenses and still help Carolyn with school." That night, unable to sleep, I found myself in Dad's study at home, surrounded by medical journals and family photos, trying to make sense of spreadsheets that painted a picture of our family's precarious financial reality. My parents had sacrificed everything to give Carolyn and I the best possible opportunities. They had poured their savings into our educations, our extracurricular activities, our dreams for the future. Now when they needed security most, there was nothing left. I spent hours staring at those numbers, thinking about my own future and the choices that lay ahead of me. I could continue with my pre-med track, graduate from Yale, go to medical school, and eventually become the doctor my parents had always envisioned. In 10 years, I'd be in a position to help them financially, assuming it wasn't too late by then. Or I could do something that seemed completely insane to everyone around me.
The software prototype I'd been developing in my spare time, the database management system that had started as a solution to Yale's administrative problems, had evolved into something much more sophisticated. I'd been refining it for months, adding features and capabilities that I knew could revolutionize how businesses handled large-scale data processing. A few companies had already expressed interest, and I had a meeting with a potential client in Hartford the following week.
The meeting had been arranged almost as a lark, a chance to test whether my academic project had real-world applications. But now, staring at my family's financial crisis, that meeting suddenly represented something much more significant, a potential lifeline. I made a decision that night that would define the next 3 years of my life. Instead of returning to Yale immediately, I would take a semester off to explore whether my software could generate enough income to help my family through this crisis. I told myself it was temporary, just a brief detour before returning to my pre-med studies. I never could have imagined that this temporary detour would transform me into one of the youngest tech entrepreneurs in the country. The meeting in Hartford went better than my wildest expectations. The insurance company didn't just want to license my software, they wanted to partner with me to develop a comprehensive data management solution for their entire Northeast operations. The initial contract was worth $200,000, more money than I'd ever seen in my life. But instead of celebration, I felt a strange mixture of excitement and terror. Success meant abandoning the safe path my parents had mapped out for me. It meant disappointing them by leaving Yale, at least temporarily. It meant betting everything on an uncertain future in an industry they didn't understand. More importantly, it meant keeping secrets from the people I loved most. I convinced myself that the deception was temporary and necessary. I would build the business quietly, generate enough income to secure my family's financial future, and then eventually return to my medical studies, with everyone being the wiser. My parents would never have to know how close they'd come to financial disaster, and they'd never have to feel guilty about the sacrifices I was making to help them through this crisis. It seemed like the perfect plan. I would be their guardian angel, protecting them from worry while building something extraordinary. I would prove that I could be successful in my own way, even if that way looked different from what they'd envisioned. What I didn't anticipate was how difficult it would be to maintain that fiction as my success grew beyond anything I'd imagined possible. What started as a temporary sacrifice to help my family through a medical crisis had evolved into a completely different life, one that I was passionate about but couldn't share with the people whose approval meant everything to me. And now, 3.5 years later, that well-intentioned deception had created a situation where the people I'd been trying to protect saw me as their greatest disappointment, while I'd become someone they could never have imagined in their wildest dreams. What began as a 6-month plan to help my family through a medical crisis slowly transformed into a complex web of deception that consumed every aspect of my life. By the end of my first year away from Yale, what I'd thought would be a simple, temporary sacrifice had become something far more complicated and demanding than I'd ever imagined. The initial success with the Hartford Insurance Company had opened doors I hadn't even known existed. Word spread quickly through corporate networks about the young developer who'd created a revolutionary data management system. And suddenly, I was fielding calls from companies across the Northeast. Each new client brought more revenue, but also more responsibility, more complexity, and more reasons why I couldn't simply wrap up the business and return to my pre-med studies as originally planned. The financial pressure on my family, meanwhile, had only intensified. Dad's recovery from his heart attack was progressing, but slowly, and the medical bills were astronomical. Even with insurance, the copays, deductibles, and out-of-network specialist fees were draining their savings at an alarming rate. Caring worked as an after-school tutor at the high school, and Caroline, still in medical school, was struggling with her own financial pressures.
She'd taken on additional student loans to cover living expenses, and I could see the stress wearing on her during family visits. She was working part-time at a research lab while maintaining a full course load, surviving on 4 hours of sleep and instant ramen, all while trying to maintain the grades necessary to secure a competitive residency position. So when my business income reached the point where I could discreetly help without anyone noticing, I convinced myself it was the right thing to do. I started small. An anonymous payment toward Dad's medical bills here, a mysterious refund on Mom's car repair there. When Caroline mentioned struggling to afford textbooks for her advanced pharmacology course, I arranged for her to receive a random scholarship that covered her educational expenses for the semester. But each act of secret generosity created new complications. To maintain the fiction that I was just doing freelance computer work, I had to carefully limit how much money I could claim to be earning. I opened multiple bank accounts under different business entities, created elaborate paper trails to disguise the source of family financial assistance, and became an expert at what I privately called creative philanthropy, finding ways to help my loved ones without revealing that I was the source of their good fortune. The psychological toll was exhausting. Every family dinner became a performance where I had to pretend to be struggling financially while secretly managing a business that was generating more revenue each month than my father had earned in some entire years of medical practice. When my parents worried aloud about money, I had to bite my tongue to keep from reassuring them that everything would be fine. When they suggested I look for real employment or consider returning to school, I had to nod thoughtfully while knowing that my fake job was more successful than most people's lifelong careers.
The technical demands of growing the business were equally challenging. What had started as a simple database management system had evolved into a comprehensive software suite with multiple modules, each requiring constant updates, customer support, and integration with existing corporate systems. I was simultaneously the CEO, lead developer, customer service representative, and marketing department of a company that was rapidly expanding beyond what one person could reasonably manage. I was working 16-hour days while maintaining the appearance of having abundant free time, holding international conference calls from my childhood bedroom while my parents assumed I was probably playing computer games. The isolation was perhaps the most difficult aspect of the entire situation. I couldn't share my successes with anyone who mattered to me. When I landed a $1 million contract with a major retail chain, I celebrated alone in my room with a gas station energy drink. When Forbes mentioned my company in an article about innovative small businesses, I couldn't show the article to my parents because it would have raised too many questions about how I'd achieved such recognition. I began to live in two completely separate worlds that could never intersect. In the business world, I was Valentina Reeves, the brilliant young entrepreneur who was revolutionizing data management technology. I attended virtual conferences, participated in industry panels, and was courted by venture capital firms who saw enormous potential in what I was building. My professional reputation was growing rapidly, and I was gaining recognition as one of the most promising tech innovators of my generation. But in Millbrook, I was still just Tina, the girl who dropped out of Yale and couldn't seem to figure out what to do with her life. The contrast between these two identities became increasingly difficult to maintain as my business success grew, and my family's perception of me as a failure became more entrenched. The situation became even more complicated when I started receiving requests for media interviews and speaking engagements. Technology magazines wanted to profile the young CEO who'd built a multi-million-dollar company from her bedroom. Industry conferences invited me to speak about entrepreneurship and innovation. A major publisher approached me about writing a book on tech entrepreneurship for women. All of these opportunities would have been career-defining moments, chances to establish myself as a thought leader in my field and inspire other young entrepreneurs. But accepting any of them would have meant revealing my identity and explaining to my family why I'd been lying to them for years about what I was actually doing with my life.
So I turned them all down, watching from the sidelines as other entrepreneurs with less innovative ideas but more traditional backgrounds received the recognition and opportunities that should have been mine. I became a ghost in my own industry, successful but invisible, influential but anonymous. The emotional cost of maintaining this double life was becoming unbearable. I was proud of what I'd accomplished, but I couldn't share that pride with anyone. I was helping my family in ways that would have amazed them, but I couldn't let them know about my generosity. I was building something extraordinary, but I had to pretend it was ordinary, even trivial. Worst of all, I could see how my perceived lack of direction was affecting the relationships with the people I loved most. Dad, who had always been my biggest supporter, began making subtle suggestions about finding focus and committing to something meaningful. Mom started making comments about other young people our age who were really making something of themselves. Even Caroline, despite being the beneficiary of my anonymous support, occasionally made remarks about my extended adolescence and lack of ambition. Each comment was like a knife to the heart, not because they were intended to be cruel, but because they were based on a complete misunderstanding of who I was and what I was sacrificing for them. I was giving up recognition, professional relationships, and personal fulfillment to protect them from financial stress. But they interpreted my sacrifice as laziness and lack of direction. By the third year, I realized I'd created a situation that was unsustainable for everyone involved. My family was carrying the emotional burden of having an unsuccessful daughter, while I was carrying the psychological burden of being unable to share my true self with the people whose approval meant everything to me. Something had to change, but I couldn't figure out how to untangle the web of well-intentioned deceptions I'd created without potentially destroying the relationships I'd been trying to protect. Sitting in my Manhattan penthouse that night, watching the video of my mother's public humiliation of me replay on an endless loop, something fundamental shifted inside my chest. It wasn't just anger or hurt, emotions I'd grown accustomed to managing over the past 3 years. This was something deeper, more primal. It was the sound of something breaking that had been under too much pressure for too long. For 3 years, I told myself that the pain was worth it, that my family's happiness and financial security justified the personal cost of living as a ghost in my own life. I'd convinced myself that their perception of me as a failure was a small price to pay for their ability to sleep peacefully at night, not knowing how close they'd come to losing everything. But watching my mother stand in front of half our town, a town where I had secretly funded playground equipment, computer labs, and scholarship programs, and systematically destroy my character while sipping wine that I probably paid for through one of my anonymous community contributions, I realized that I hadn't been protecting anyone. I'd been enabling a lie that was destroying us all in different ways.
The breaking point wasn't just about the cruelty of her words, though they cut deep enough to leave scars. It was the sudden, crystal clear understanding that I'd spent 3 years sacrificing not just my own happiness, but potentially my family's as well. By hiding my success, I'd robbed them of the chance to be proud of me. By concealing my generosity, I denied them the opportunity to understand how much they meant to me. By maintaining the fiction of my failure, I'd forced them to carry the burden of disappointment and worry that I could have lifted with a single honest conversation. The video had 847 views when I first watched it. By the time I'd finished processing its implications, it had over 1,200. My public humiliation was spreading through social media like wildfire, and people I'd known since childhood were commenting with their own observations about my supposed lack of direction and ambition. "I always wondered what happened to Valentina," wrote Jessica Morrison, a girl I'd been lab partners with in high school chemistry. "She seemed so smart back then. Just goes to show you never know how people will turn out." "Feel bad for Patricia and William," added someone else. "They invested so much in that girl's education just to have her throw it all away. Must be heartbreaking." Each comment was like a physical blow.
not because they were necessarily cruel, but because they were based on a version of reality that was so fundamentally wrong, it felt like living in an alternate universe. These people were mourning the waste of potential in someone who had actually exceeded every expectation they had ever had for her. They were pitying parents whose daughter had secretly become more successful than anyone in their small town could have imagined. But perhaps most devastating was reading the comments from people who knew my family well. People who had watched me grow up and remembered the ambitious, driven teenager I'd been. Their surprise and disappointment cut deepest because I could see reflections of my parents' own journey from pride to concern to resigned disappointment over the past 3 years. I remember when Valentina won the state science fair. Her project on algorithmic optimization was years ahead of anything I'd seen from a high school student. Such a shame she couldn't channel that brilliance into something lasting. The irony was so sharp it was almost funny. Algorithmic optimization had become the foundation of my entire business empire. The project Mrs. Chen remembered had directly led to the innovations that were now running on servers across 3 continents. That teenage brilliance she was mourning hadn't disappeared. It had grown into something that was changing entire industries. As I scrolled through comment after comment of people reflecting on my supposed fall from grace, I began to understand the true scope of what my deception had cost. Not just me, but everyone who ever cared about me. My high school teachers, who had invested extra time in helping me develop my potential, now believed their efforts had been wasted. My former classmates who had looked up to me academically now saw me as a cautionary tale about squandered opportunities. My parents' friends and colleagues, who had watched them beam with pride about my early achievements, now offered them sympathy for their disappointment. I was not just hiding my success, I was allowing an entire community to believe in a narrative of failure that reflected poorly on everyone who had ever invested in me. My deception wasn't protecting my family's feelings, it was forcing them to live with the public shame of having raised a daughter who couldn't live up to her potential. The realization hit me like a physical blow. I hadn't been noble or selfless, I had been a coward. I'd been so afraid of my parents' potential disappointment about my unconventional path that I'd chosen to let them live with the much deeper disappointment of believing I had no path at all. I'd been so worried about their reaction to learning I'd left Yale that I'd allowed them to suffer years of worry about my future and embarrassment about my present. I'd been so concerned about protecting them from the complexity of my choices that I'd forced them to carry the burden of disappointment and worry that I could have lifted with a single honest conversation. The phone calls I'd overheard my parents late at night suddenly took on new meaning. The hushed conversations about what went wrong and where we failed her and how to motivate her to get her life together weren't just about their concern for my future. They were about their own sense of failure as parents. They blamed themselves for my perceived lack of direction, carried guilt about somehow not preparing me adequately for adult life, and worried constantly about what would happen to me when they were no longer around to provide support. I had put my parents through 3 years of emotional torture, all in the name of protecting them. The business success that I'd been so proud of, the community contributions that had made me feel like a secret hero, the financial support that I thought made me their guardian angel, none of it mattered if the people I loved most believed I was a failure. Success without recognition might be noble in abstract terms, but when that lack of recognition caused active pain to the people you cared most about, it became something entirely different. Selfishness disguised as sacrifice.
I thought about my father, lying awake at night worrying about my future financial security, not knowing that I was already more financially secure than he'd ever dreamed of being. I thought about my mother, probably lying awake right now, feeling guilty about the harsh words she'd spoken at the charity auction, not knowing that her unsuccessful daughter had anonymously funded half the community programs she spent her days advocating for. I thought about Caroline carrying the extra pressure of being the successful child, not knowing that her supposedly struggling sister had been secretly supporting her education and career development. Sitting there in my penthouse, surrounded by the tangible evidence of achievements my family couldn't even imagine, I finally understood that the choice I'd made 3 years ago to protect them from the truth had evolved into something that was hurting all of us in ways I'd never intended. The time for protection was over. The time for truth had arrived, whether I was ready for it or not. At 2:47 a.m., sitting cross-legged on the marble floor of my penthouse with my laptop open and 3 years' worth of financial records spread around me like evidence at a crime scene, I made the decision that would change everything. The moment wasn't dramatic or cinematic. There were no lightning bolts of inspiration or orchestral swells of determination. It was simply the quiet, inevitable conclusion to a night of brutal self-reflection. I was done living a lie. But deciding to tell the truth and actually figuring out how to tell it were two entirely different challenges. How do you explain to your family that you've been deceiving them for 3 years? How do you reveal that everything they believe about you is wrong without making them feel foolish for believing it? How do you prove that your deception came from love without invalidating the very real pain it had caused? I spent the next 4 hours methodically building what I privately called the Truth Portfolio, a comprehensive collection of documents, screenshots, contracts, and financial records that would make my story undeniable. Bank statements showing the growth of Nexus Technologies from a few $1,000s to a $50 million valuation. Contracts with Fortune 500 companies bearing my signature. Board meeting minutes where I was listed as CEO and primary shareholder. Screenshots of international news articles mentioning my company's innovations. But the portfolio wasn't just about proving my business success. I also compiled evidence of every anonymous contribution I'd made to my family and community over the past 3 years. Donation receipts for the hospital pediatric wing, the community center improvements, the scholarship fund. Bank records showing the mysterious grants and fellowships that had helped my father's medical practice and Caroline's education. Correspondence with the various foundations and organizations I'd used as intermediaries to hide my identity while supporting the people and causes I cared about. As dawn broke over Manhattan, painting the city in shades of gold and amber, I realized that simply presenting evidence wouldn't be enough. I needed to do something that would be impossible to ignore, something that would grab my family's attention so completely that they'd have no choice but to listen to what I had to say. The days of subtle revelations and gentle conversations had passed. This situation called for something dramatic, something that would cut through 3 years of accumulated misunderstanding in a single, unforgettable moment. That's what I remembered the conversation I'd had with my corporate pilot, Marcus Delacroix, just 2 weeks earlier. I'd been chartering his services for business flights for a year, and he'd mentioned during our flight to a client meeting in Boston that his company specialized in unique aviation experiences for high-net-worth clients. When I'd asked what that meant, he smiled and told me about surprise proposals on private islands, anniversary celebrations at 30,000 feet, and dramatic business announcements that required unconventional transportation solutions. He once had a tech executive who wanted to surprise his hometown by landing a corporate jet in the middle of their annual festival, he'd said with a laugh. Turns out he'd grown up there but moved away for business. He wanted to make a dramatic entrance when he came back to announce that he was relocating his company headquarters to his old neighborhood. Created quite the stir, as you can imagine. At the time, I'd filed the story away as an amusing anecdote. Now it felt like inspiration. Millbrook's zoning laws were surprisingly flexible when it came to emergency and temporary aircraft landings, a holdover from the town's agricultural past when crop dusters regularly used large fields for maintenance and fuel stops. My parents' house sat on 3 acres of flat, well-maintained land that had once been part of a larger farm. The backyard was more than adequate for a small corporate jet, especially with an experienced pilot who specialized in unconventional landing sites.
I called Marcus at 7 a.m., well aware that I was probably waking him up, but too energized by my plan to wait for business hours. "Valentina," he answered, sounding surprised but alert. "Is everything all right? Do you need an emergency flight somewhere?" "Actually, Marcus, I need something much more complicated than that," I said, pacing back and forth across my penthouse living room. "How would you feel about making the most dramatic entrance in Millbrook, Connecticut's history?" What followed was a 40-minute conversation that covered everything from Federal Aviation Administration regulations to homeowners' insurance liability to the precise measurements of my parents' backyard. Marcus was initially skeptical. Landing a private jet on residential property wasn't exactly standard operating procedure, but his enthusiasm grew as I explained the situation and the importance of making an undeniable statement. "So let me get this straight," he said finally. "You've been running a multi-million-dollar business from your childhood bedroom while your family thinks you're unemployed? And now you want to reveal the truth by landing a Gulfstream on their front lawn?"
Technically, it would be the back lawn, I corrected. And yes, that's exactly what I want to do. His laughter was warm and genuinely delighted. "Valentina, in 15 years of corporate aviation, this is definitely the most interesting request I've ever received. When do you want to do this?" "Today," I said without hesitation. "This afternoon, if possible." The logistics were more complex than I'd anticipated, but Marcus proved why he commanded premium rights for his services. Within 2 hours, he'd filed the necessary flight plans, coordinated with local authorities to ensure we wouldn't violate any safety regulations, and even arranged for a ground crew to assess the landing site and mark any potential hazards. But the flight arrangements were only the beginning of my preparation. I spent the morning crafting what I thought of as the speech. Not a formal presentation, but a heartfelt explanation of why I'd made the choices I had and what I hoped would happen next. I practiced it while looking out at Central Park, imagining my family's faces as they heard the truth for the first time. I also called my assistant, Rebecca Chen, who managed the New York office of Nexus Technologies and was one of the few people who knew about my unconventional living situation. I asked her to prepare a presentation packet that would help my family understand the scope and impact of what I'd built. Financial summaries that translated corporate valuations into terms that would be meaningful to a small-town family. Client testimonials that explained how our software was being used by companies they'd recognize. Impact reports showing how many jobs we'd created and how many communities had benefited from our charitable contributions. "Are you sure you're ready for this?" Rebecca asked when I explained what I was planning. She'd been with the company since the early days and understood better than anyone how much I'd sacrificed to maintain my anonymity. "I should have done this 2 years ago. I've been so afraid of my family's reaction to learning I'd lied to them that I kept lying, which only made everything worse. At some point, you have to stop protecting people from the truth and start trusting them to handle it." The flight from Manhattan to Millbrook would take less than an hour, but I knew that those 60 minutes would represent the end of one life and the beginning of another. For 3 years, I'd been Valentina Reeves, the secret entrepreneur, living in the shadows of my own success. After today, I would simply be Valentina Reeves, daughter, sister, community member, and yes, CEO of a company that had grown far beyond anything my teenage self could have imagined. As I gathered my documents and prepared to leave for the airfield, I felt something I hadn't experienced in 3 years. Genuine excitement about sharing my achievements with the people whose opinions mattered most to me. Whatever happened next, at least it would be real. The drive from Teterboro Airport to Millbrook in the back of Marcus's ground transportation vehicle felt like traveling through a time warp. Every familiar landmark, the exit sign for Route 44, the old red barn that had been converted into an antique shop, and the Welcome to Millbrook sign with its cheerful proclamation of population 8,847 reminded me of who I used to be in this place and how different that person was from who I'd become. Marcus had suggested we arrive in Millbrook 2 hours before the planned landing to conduct what he called final site reconnaissance and safety preparation. In reality, I suspected he wanted to give me time to build up my courage, and I was grateful for his intuition.
The closer we got to my childhood home, the more the magnitude of what I was about to do began to sink in. "Have you considered calling ahead?" Marcus asked, gently, as we pulled into the parking lot of Millbrook's small municipal building where we'd arranged to meet with the local police chief to ensure our dramatic arrival wouldn't cause any safety issues or legal complications. Meaning, showing up unannounced in a private jet is certainly memorable, but it might be quite a shock for your family. I'd been wrestling with that exact question all morning. Part of me wanted to call my parents to give them some warning that their world was about to change dramatically, but I knew that if I gave them advance notice, they'd have time to process, to ask questions, to potentially talk me out of what I was planning. The element of surprise wasn't just for dramatic effect, it was strategically necessary to ensure they'd have to listen to my entire explanation before forming judgments or reactions. "The shock is kind of the point," I said, though I could hear the uncertainty in my own voice. "They've been shocked by my supposed failure for 3 years. Now they get to be shocked by my actual success." Chief Harrison of the Millbrook Police Department turned out to be someone I vaguely remembered from high school, Danny Harrison, who'd been 2 years ahead of me and had played varsity basketball. He'd aged into the kind of steady, competent authority figure that small towns depend on, and his reaction to our unusual request was a mixture of professional caution and barely concealed amusement. "So, let me understand this correctly," he said, reviewing the flight plans and safety documentation that Marcus had prepared. "You want to land a corporate jet in your parents' backyard to surprise them with the news that you're not actually unemployed?" "That's a considerable simplification, but essentially correct," I replied, feeling slightly ridiculous when the plan was reduced to such basic terms.
Chief Harrison studied me for a moment, and I could see recognition dawning in his eyes. Valentina Reeves, Patricia and William's daughter. I heard you'd moved back home after college. The casual way he said it, as if my return to Millbrook was common knowledge and unremarkable, reminded me how thoroughly my cover story had penetrated the community consciousness. To everyone in town, I was just another young adult who'd struggled to launch successfully into independent adulthood. The idea that I might be arriving via private jet to reveal a secret business empire would have seemed like pure fantasy. "The landing itself poses no significant safety risks," Marcus interjected, spreading out detailed aerial photographs of my parents' property. "The backyard provides adequate clearance, and we've confirmed that the ground conditions can support the aircraft weight. We're planning for a 4 p.m. touchdown, which gives us optimal lighting and minimal air traffic." As we reviewed the technical details, I found myself mentally rehearsing the conversation I'd be having with my family in less than 3 hours. How do you begin a revelation that overturns 3 years of carefully constructed deception? Do you start with an apology? An explanation? A dramatic declaration? I'd settled on a simple opening. "I need to tell you who I really am." But even as I practiced the words, I knew that the real challenge wouldn't be in the telling, it would be in helping my family understand not just what I'd been hiding, but why I'd felt the need to hide it. How do you explain that your deception came from love without making it sound like a justification? How do you acknowledge the pain you've caused while also asking for forgiveness? After completing our coordination with local authorities, Marcus and I drove slowly through downtown Millbrook, and I found myself seeing my hometown through the eyes of the person I'd become, rather than the person I'd been when I left for Yale. The small business district that had seemed so limiting when I was 18 now looked charming and full of potential. I noticed details I'd missed during my previous visits home. New storefronts that had opened, improvements to the public spaces, signs of a community that was adapting and growing. I realized with a start that some of those improvements were things I'd anonymously funded. The new benches in Memorial Park, installed last spring through a municipal beautification grant that I'd arranged. The upgraded Wi-Fi system at the public library, made possible by a technology infrastructure donation from an unnamed benefactor.
The scholarship plaques at the high school, honoring students who'd received financial assistance from the Millbrook Excellence Foundation that existed solely because I'd created and funded it. I'd been contributing to this community's growth and vitality for 3 years without anyone knowing it, including my own family. The irony was almost overwhelming. I'd become one of Millbrook's most significant benefactors while being perceived as one of its least successful residents. Our final stop was the house itself. Marcus needed to assess the landing zone one more time, and I needed to see the place where my childhood had been spent and where my adult revelation would unfold. We parked across the street, and I stared at the modest colonial house where I grew up, where my parents still lived, where they'd spent 3 years worrying about their daughter's future, while that same daughter was secretly building an empire. The backyard looked smaller than I remembered, though Marcus assured me it would be adequate for our purposes. I could see Mom's garden, meticulously maintained despite her busy schedule as principal, Dad's workshop, where he'd taught me to use power tools and where I'd first learned that I enjoyed building things. The deck where we'd had countless family barbecues, where Carolyn and I studied for exams, where my parents probably sat many evenings over the past 3 years discussing their concerns about my lack of direction. "Are you ready for this?" Marcus asked quietly. I thought about the question seriously. Was I ready to see my parents' faces when they realized how completely they'd misunderstood my life? Was I ready to explain why I'd let them believe I was a failure while I was actually more successful than anyone in our family had ever been? Was I ready to ask for their forgiveness while also asking them to be proud of me? I don't think anyone could be ready for this, I said finally, but I'm definitely ready to stop pretending to be someone I'm not. Marcus smiled and checked his watch. Then we should head to the airfield. It's time to go collect your jet and change your family's understanding of reality. As we drove away from Maple Street, I felt a strange combination of terror and relief. In 2 hours, the most elaborate deception of my life would finally end. Whatever happened next, at least it would be true. At exactly 3:47 p.m., I felt the Gulfstream G650 begin its descent towards Millbrook, and my heart started beating so hard I was certain Marcus could hear it over the engine noise. Through the aircraft's oval windows, I could see my hometown spread out below like a detailed model train set. The main street I'd walk to school every day, the high school where Mom still worked as principal, the medical complex where Dad had built his practice, and there, nestled among the maple trees that gave our street its name, the modest colonial house where everything was about to change.
Final approach in 60 seconds, Marcus announced through the intercom, his voice calm and professional despite the unconventional nature of our landing. "I can see your parents' property clearly, and the backyard looks perfect for touchdown." I pressed my face against the window and spotted 2 figures in the backyard. My parents, probably doing their usual Saturday afternoon yard work. Even from this altitude, I could see them both look up at the sound of our approaching aircraft, shading their eyes against the afternoon sun as they tried to identify the source of the unexpected noise. In small towns like Millbrook, private jets didn't exactly blend into the background. The landing was smoother than I dared to hope. Marcus brought us down with the precision of someone who'd made a career out of impossible aviation requests, the aircraft touching the grass with barely a bump before rolling to a stop roughly 30 feet from my mother's prized rose garden. Through the window, I watched my parents stand frozen in apparent shock, rakes and gardening tools forgotten in their hands as they stared at the sleek corporate jet that had just materialized in their backyard. For a moment, nobody moved. The engines wound down, filling the air with the kind of silence that feels heavy with possibility. I could see neighbors beginning to emerge from their houses, drawn by the unmistakable sound of aircraft engines in a residential neighborhood. Mrs. Patterson from next door was standing on her front porch with her mouth hanging open. The Yamamoto family had come out of their garage and were pointing at our jet with expressions of complete bewilderment. "Ready to make history?" Marcus asked, unstrapping himself from the pilot seat and moving toward the cabin door. I took a deep breath, gathered the leather portfolio containing 3 years' worth of evidence, and nodded.
Let's do this. The cabin door opened with a soft hydraulic hiss, and I stepped out onto the retractable stairs, feeling like I was emerging from a spaceship into a world that no longer quite made sense. The late afternoon air carried the familiar sense of my childhood. Fresh-cut grass, my mother's roses, the faint smell of wood smoke from someone's fireplace. But everything else about this moment was surreal beyond anything I could have imagined. My parents were walking toward the aircraft slowly, as if approaching a mirage that might disappear if they moved too quickly. I could see the exact moment when recognition dawned on my father's face, the confused frown transforming into wide-eyed shock as he realized that his supposedly unemployed daughter had just stepped out of a private jet in his backyard. "Valentina?" Mom's voice carried across the yard, high and uncertain. "What? How? Whose plane is this?" I walked toward them with what I hoped looked like confidence, though my legs felt unsteady beneath me. Caroline's car was pulling into the driveway. She must have been visiting for the weekend, which meant I'd have my entire immediate family present for this revelation. Perfect timing, or the universe's idea of a cosmic joke. "Hi, Mom. Hi, Dad," I said when I was close enough for normal conversation, though nothing about this situation could be described as normal. "I know this is probably confusing, but I need to tell you something important. Actually, I need to tell you everything." Caroline had climbed out of her car and was walking toward us with the expression of someone who'd arrived at what she thought was a quiet family weekend, only to find a private jet parked in their backyard. "Tina, what is happening right now? Whose plane is that?" "It's mine," I said simply, the words feeling strange and wonderful after 3 years of hiding them. "The plane is mine, and so is the company that paid for it, and so are about 50 other things you don't know about yet." The silence that followed was the kind that seems to stretch time itself. I watched my family's faces cycle through confusion, disbelief, and the dawning realization that their understanding of reality was about to be fundamentally altered. Dad was the first to speak. "Valentina, I don't understand. You said you were doing some freelance computer work. You've been living in your childhood bedroom for 3 years. How could you possibly own a private jet?" "That's what I need to explain," I said, opening my portfolio and pulling out the first document, the incorporation papers for Nexus Technologies with my name clearly listed as founder and CEO. For the past 3 years, I haven't been failing at life. I've been building a business empire, and I've been doing it while secretly supporting our family and our entire community in ways you never knew about. I handed the incorporation papers to my father and watched his eyes scan the document, his medical training making him naturally careful about examining evidence. "Nexus Technologies," he read out loud. "Incorporated 3 years ago. Primary business, software development and data management solutions. CEO and majority shareholder, Valentina Catherine Reeves." "That's impossible," Caroline said, but her voice lacked conviction. She was staring at the jet, at the corporate logos on its fuselage, at the obvious expense of everything she was seeing. "Tina, you can't just own a company worth enough to buy private jets. We would have known." "Would you?" I asked gently. "When's the last time any of you asked me specific questions about what I do all day? When's the last time you showed interest in my work beyond suggesting I find something more traditional?" I pulled out the next set of documents, financial statements showing Nexus Technologies' growth from startup to $50 million valuation, bank records detailing the anonymous donations to Millbrook General Hospital, the scholarship funds, the community improvement grants, contracts with Fortune 500 companies whose names my family would recognize, email correspondence with venture capital firms, government agencies, international business partners.
Every mysterious phone call you thought was fake? Those were real client meetings and board conferences. Every hour you thought I was wasting time on my computer. I was building software that now runs critical systems for companies across 3 continents. Every day you worried about my lack of direction, I was creating jobs for hundreds of people and opportunities for thousands more. Mom sank onto one of the patio chairs, still holding the hospital donation records that showed her daughter had anonymously funded the pediatric wing she'd been advocating for in school board meetings. "The children's wing," she whispered. "The mysterious benefactor who wouldn't identify themselves? That was you?" "That was me," I confirmed. Just like the community center renovations, the library computer upgrades, the scholarship fund at your school, and about 20 other projects that you've probably praised the anonymous donors for over the past 3 years. I could see my family beginning to process not just the magnitude of my success, but the implications of my secrecy. Their expressions were cycling through shock, confusion, hurt, and something that might have been the beginning of pride. "But why?" Dad asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Why would you hide this from us? Why would you let us think you were struggling?" "Because I was terrified," I admitted. "Because I left Yale without graduating, and I knew you'd be disappointed. Because I built something unconventional in an industry you didn't understand, and I was afraid you wouldn't see it as real success. Because I thought I was protecting you from complexity and uncertainty, but instead I was just protecting myself from your potential judgment." Caroline was reading through the client contracts, her medical training making her naturally analytical about evidence. "These companies," she said slowly, "these are major corporations, global firms. They're paying you millions of dollars for your software?" "They are," I confirmed. "And yesterday, Forbes called to ask if I wanted to be featured on their 30 under 30 list for technology innovation. I turned them down because I couldn't figure out how to accept recognition without explaining to my family why I'd been lying for 3 years." The sun was beginning to set behind the maple trees, casting long shadows across the backyard where my childhood had unfolded and where my adult truth was finally being revealed. Neighbors were gathering at respectful distances, clearly curious about the private jet, but polite enough not to intrude on what was obviously a family moment. "So what happens now?" Mom asked, and I could hear years of worry and disappointment beginning to transform into something else. Maybe pride, maybe relief, maybe just the exhaustion that comes from learning that everything you believed was wrong. I looked at my family, at the people I'd been trying to protect by hiding my success, at the parents who'd spent 3 years thinking they'd failed as guides for their daughter's future, at the sister who'd carried extra pressure as the family's only successful child. Tomorrow, they would wake up in a world where the Reeves family's disappointment had become the Reeves family's secret success story. "Now," I said, "we figure out how to be proud of each other for who we actually are, instead of disappointed in each other for who we thought we were supposed to be."